In this video, we'll review Part 2 of Chapter 37 and look at Eisenhower's foreign policy and cultural renaissance. There was a new look in foreign policy during this time period, and in 1952 the Republican platform condemned the containment policy and called for a new look in foreign policy. John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State, promised to roll back the red tide and liberate captive peoples. Eisenhower also promised to balance the budget by cutting military spending, and Dulles announced a policy of boldness in 1954, which relegated the Army and Navy to the back seat and built up the fleet of the Strategic Air Command superbombers, which were equipped with city-flattening weapons. They were meant to inflict massive retaliation on the Soviets or Chinese. This is another innovation during the 1950s called the drive-in movie theater, where Americans went to the movies in the 1950s. The advantage of using the Strategic Air Command was nuclear intimidation with a cheaper price tag. Eisenhower sought to thaw the Cold War after Stalin's death through negotiations with new Soviet leaders, but in the end this new look proved illusory. Nikita Khrushchev rejected Eisenhower's call for open skies and a mutual inspection program, and Ike refused to aid the Hungarian Uprising of 1956. America's nuclear sledgehammer, he felt, was too heavy for the relatively minor crisis. This exposed the strategic limitations of the policy of massive retaliation. The Vietnam nightmare deepens during this time period, and with Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh, nationalists had sought to end the French colonial rule, and Ho Chi Minh had appealed to Wilson in 1919 for self-determination. But the Cold War dampened the dreams of the anti-colonial Asia. Their leaders became increasingly communist, while the United States became increasingly anti-communist. By 1954, America was paying 80% of the war costs in Indochina, which amounted to about $1 billion a year, and was done partly to get the French approval for the rearmed West Germany, and West Germany entered NATO in 1955. French rule crumbled under Ho Chi Minh's nationalist guerrillas called the Viet Minh. The French garrisons were trapped in the forest of Dien Bien Phu. The policy of boldness was here tested. Some, with the example of Nixon, favored intervention with U.S. bombers, but Eisenhower held back. So at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, a victory for the nationalists ended up coming about. A multi-nation conference in Geneva then halved Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh in the north consented to the arrangement on the assurance that Vietnam-wide elections would be held within 2 years. In the south, the pro-Western government under Ngo Dien Diem was entrenched at Saigon, but they refused to hold the promised elections. So the USA provided aid to Diem. Diem faced a growing campaign by communist guerrillas, and America backed a losing horse in Diem, but they couldn't see any other way to call off the bet. Cold War crises in the Middle East deepened during this time period also, with fears that the Soviets would penetrate the oil-rich Middle East, and these heightened the Cold War tensions. The Iranian government resisted Western oil companies, but the CIA helped engineer a coup in 1953 that installed Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as dictator. The U.S. intervention created resentment among Iranians. 2 decades later, Iranians took revenge on the Shah and his American allies. The Hungarian Uprising was when the Soviet tanks rolled through the streets of Budapest to crush an anti-communist uprising against them, who had controlled Hungary since World War II. The United States did not provide aid. The Suez Crisis was when Egypt's Nasser sought funds to build a dam on the Nile River. America tentatively offered financial help, but when Nasser began to deal with communists, Dulles withdrew the dam offer. Nasser then nationalized the Suez Canal, which was owned chiefly by the British and the French stockholders. Britain and France, with the help from Israel, staged an assault on Egypt in October of 1956, thinking that they would get help from the United States. A furious Eisenhower refused to release the emergency oil supplies, and the UN force was sent in after the oilless invaders withdrew. This is a picture of Egyptian independence leader Nasser in 1954, shown here greeting supporters alongside the visiting Sudanese prime minister. The Suez Crisis was the last time the United States could use the oil weapon. In 1940, the United States had produced 2/3 of the world's oil, with 5% coming from the Middle East. By 1948, the United States had become the net oil importer. Arab nations attempted to keep more of the profit from their oil exports. So in 1960, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, called OPEC, was formed. Member nations included Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and Venezuela. And within 2 decades, OPEC's stranglehold on the Western economies would tighten. Eisenhower will run for election for a second time in the election of 1956. He is pitted against Adlai Stevenson, and the voters still liked Ike, so the results were overwhelmingly the popular vote for Eisenhower, and the Electoral College, the electoral votes, 457 for Republicans, only 73 for the Democrats. Eisenhower made deep roads into the Democratic South, but he failed to win either House of Congress for the GOP. Fraud and gangsterism tarnished unions and especially Teamsters during this time period. The AFL-CIO expelled James Jimmy Hoffa, who was convicted of jury tampering and served part of his sentence before disappearing without a trace. Eisenhower persuaded Congress to pass the Landrum-Griffin Act in 1959, which was designed to bring labor leaders to account for financial shenanigans and bullying tactics. This was expanded into some anti-labor strictures of the Taft-Hartley Act. During this time period also, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 and 2 into space in 1957, which was a shock to American self-confidence and security. So rocket fever swept the nation. Eisenhower created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, called NASA. The Vanguard missile exploded on national television, and by the end of the decade, several satellites had been launched, and the United States had successfully tested its own ICBMs. Sputnik spurred changes in the U.S. educational system, and in 1958, the National Defense and Education Act was passed. This promoted research and teaching in sciences, engineering, and foreign languages. The nuclear arms race and tensions over Berlin continued. Eisenhower invited Khrushchev to Washington in 1959. Khrushchev met with Eisenhower at Camp David. Optimism evaporated quickly prior to the Paris summit of 1960. On the eve of the conference, the American U-2 plane was shot down over the Soviet Union, and Honest Ike eventually took full personal responsibility, but this ended the Paris conference. The Cold War continued. Uncle Sam in Latin America. The Latin Americans resented the meager U.S. aid, and they chafed at America's continuing habit of intervening in Latin American affairs. For example, the CIA was interfering in Guatemala in 1954. Washington supported the dictators who claimed to be combating communists. Cuba's dictator, Fulgencio Batista, encouraged a huge investment of American capital, and Washington gave him support. But in 1959, Fidel Castro engineered a revolution to oust Batista, and Castro denounced the Yankee imperialists. Castro began to expropriate American properties and pursue land distribution programs. Washington then cut off U.S. imports of Cuban sugar. Castro retaliated by confiscating Yankee property and made his dictatorship an economic and military satellite of Moscow. Anti-Castro Cubans headed for the United States, especially Florida. Washington broke diplomatic relations with Cuba in 1961 and imposed a strict embargo on the trade with Cuba. This is the embargo that President Obama is currently lifting in its new relationship with Cuba. In the election of 1960, Kennedy challenges Nixon for the presidency. The Republicans put up the new Nixon, who represented himself as mature and a seasoned statesman. He gained notice in the kitchen debate with Khrushchev in Moscow in 1959, where Nixon extolled the virtues of American consumerism over Soviet economic planning. and he won the Republican nomination. The Democrats put up John F. Kennedy, who won impressive victories in the primaries. Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, JFK's rival for the nomination and Senate Majority Leader, accepted the VP slot on the ticket. Kennedy was the first Roman Catholic to be nominated by a major party since Al Smith in 1928. Kennedy rebutted attacks on his religion. His Catholicism was a problem in the Protestant Bible Belt South, which was ordinarily Democratic. But JFK's support from Northern Catholics made up for any Southern Democrats who rejected him. Television may have tipped the scales in this election. Nixon agreed to meet Kennedy in 4 debates. They reinforced the importance of image over substance in TV age. The viewers found Kennedy's glamour and vitality more appealing than Nixon's tired and pallid appearance. This is a picture of Kennedy campaigning for the presidency with his wife, Jackie Kennedy. The election results were Kennedy earned 303 electoral votes to 219 for Nixon. JFK's popular vote margin was only 118,000 votes out of over 68 million cast. He was the first Roman Catholic and youngest person elected president, and he ran well in industrial centers of America and had strong support from African Americans. He had telephoned Coretta King while Dr. King was imprisoned in Georgia. In 1960, 2 parties exhibited very different racial strategies. This is the map showing the presidential election of 1960 with the electoral vote by state. Eisenhower continued to enjoy an extraordinary popularity until the final curtain. He was admired for his decency, goodwill, and moderation. The United States grew economically and geographically during his presidency, and Alaska and Hawaii attained statehood in 1959. A cultural renaissance took place during this time period as well, while U.S. power in the post-World II decades were matched by international ascendancy in the arts. In art, Americans supported countless painters and sculptors. Tradition-free environments were congenial to experimental modern art that probed the contemporary life. Jackson Pollock pioneered abstract expressionism. Pollock and Willem de Kooning created spontaneous action paintings that expressed the painter's individuality and made a viewer a participant in defining the painting's meaning. Mark Rothko and his fellow color field painters enveloped whole canvases with bold, shimmering swaths of color. This is a picture of Roy Lichtenstein, who came into prominence as part of the pop art movement of the 1960s. He used replications of commercial printing techniques to portray blown-up images of comic strip scenes that raised new questions about the boundaries between high and low culture. Pop became short for popular artists, like Andy Warhol, who canonized on canvas mundane items of consumer culture, and Roy Lichtenstein, who you just saw, who parodied old-fashioned comic strips. Architecture also was prominent during this time period, with residential building booms erecting look-alike ranch-style houses across the suburban landscape. The ultra-modern skyscrapers arose in the nation's cities during this time period, and the international style, which was modernist, massive corporate high-rises were essentially giant steel boxes wrapped in glass, such as the UN headquarters in New York City in 1952. Frank Lloyd Wright produced original designs, such as the round-walled Guggenheim Museum in 1959, and Louis Kahn employed plain geometric forms and basic building materials, as in the Salk Institute in 1965. I.M. Pei designed the East Wing of the National Gallery of Art in 1978, as well as John F. Kennedy's Library in 1979. The greatest cultural harvest was in literature. The initial World War II literature was searing realism. Norman Mailer wrote The Naked and the Dead in 1948, and James Jones wrote From Here to Eternity in 1956. Over time, realistic World War II literature was replaced by literature that viewed war in fantastic and psychedelic prose. For example, Joseph Heller in Catch-22, 1961, dealt with the antics and anguish of U.S. airmen in the wartime Mediterranean. Kurt Vonnegut, Jr., in Slaughterhouse-Five, wrote a darkly comic war tale in 1969. Ernest Hemingway is portrayed here. He, in fiction, wrote some of the pre-war masters, but continued to be popular in the post-war era, notably The Old Man and the Sea, written in 1952. Literature debated the post-World War II consumerist society. The counterculture, beat writers, rejected the modern American life outright, seeking self-expression in stridently nonconformist lifestyles. John Updike, who wrote Rabbit Run, celebrated feats and failings of a small-town America in 1960, and Couples addressed the suburban middle-class infidelity in 1968. John Cheever, who wrote the Wapshot Chronicle in 1957, chronicled suburban manners and morals, and Gore Vidal wrote an intriguing historical novels like Myra Breckinridge in 1968. This is a beat author named Jack Kerouac, who wrote and was the voice for a generation of hipsters and wannabe nonconformists. His book, On the Road, is a very popular book to read during this time period. Poets were highly critical and even despairing about the conformist character of mid-century America. They experimented with confessional styles, revealing personal experiences with sex, drugs, and madness. Robert Lowell helped inaugurate the trend with a psychologically intense book called Life Studies in 1959, and For the Union Dead in 1964 sought to apply the wisdom of the Puritan past to the perplexing present in allegorical poems. Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar in 1963 was a disturbing autobiographical novel. Playwrights were acute observers of post-war social mores. Tennessee Williams is one of these, who wrote blistering dramas about psychological misfits struggling to hold themselves together amid the disintegrating forces of modern life. He wrote A Streetcar Named Desire in 1947 and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1955, which each critiqued restrictions placed on women's lives. Arthur Miller is another one of these playwrights who wrote Death of a Salesman, which was a tragic indictment of American drama of material success, and The Crucible, which treated the Salem witch trials as a dark parable about the dangers of McCarthyism. Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, offered a realistic portrait of African American life, and Edward Albee, who wrote Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, exposed the rapacious underside of middle-class life. Novelists often used the form of a tale, chronicling education and maturation of a young protagonist. J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye was one of these books, and it painted an unforgettable portrait of adolescent angst, alienation, and rebellion. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man in 1952 depicted African Americans' often tortured quest for personal identity. Saul Bellows' The Adventures of Augie March told the tale of the everyman struggling to make sense of the world. And Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird told of racial injustice and loss of youthful innocence. Black authors built on their earlier Harlem Renaissance successes as well. Richard Wright wrote Native Son, which was a chilling portrait of a black Chicago killer, and Black Boy, which was semi-autobiographical. James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time was sensitive to the reflections on the racial question, and black nationalist Leroy Jones, who changed his name to Imamu Amiri Baraka, crafted powerful plays such as The Dutchman in 1964. The Southern Renaissance was taking place during this time period also, and they distanced themselves from the earlier lost cause literature that had glorified the antebellum South. They brought new critical appreciation to the region's burdens of history, racism, and conservatism. This was led by William Faulkner, who was a Nobel recipient in 1950. Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men also immortalized Louisiana politico Huey Long. Walker Percy, Eudora Welty, and Flannery O'Connor all perceptively tracked the changes in the reshaping post-war South. William Styron, in The Confessions of Nat Turner, 1967, confronted the harsh history of Virginia in a fictional representation of the 1831 slave rebellion. There were also Jewish novelists, like Bernard Malamud, who wrote The Assistant, which was a touching portrait of a family of New York Jewish shopkeepers, and Philip Roth, who wrote Goodbye Columbus, which was a comical writing about a young New Jersey suburbanites, and Portnoy's Complaint, which penned an uproarious account of sexually obsessed middle-aged New Yorkers.